So picture this. It's 1953. Millions of Americans are literally in their backyards, carefully measuring out the space to dig nuclear fallout shelters.
Right, digging actual bunkers in the dirt.
Yeah, exactly. But at the exact same time, these same people are obsessing over whether their front lawns are perfectly manicured. I mean, just sit with that image for a second.
It is completely surreal.
It really is. You have people preparing for the end of the world, like the absolute vaporization of their cities, and their immediate day-to-day concern is making sure the grass is the exact right shade of green so the neighbors don't, whisper about them.
Just wild to think about.
Right. Why did the most existentially terrifying decade in human history look like this pristine, cheerful sitcom?
Well, I mean, it is the ultimate historical paradox. You look at the surface, and it's pure, unbothered innocence, like a Norman Rockwell painting.
Yeah, exactly.
But the mechanics operating just beneath that surface, they're driven by absolute terror and really rigid control.
And that is exactly what we are getting into today. So if you are listening to this right now, whether you're trying to understand the roots of modern culture or you just want to get past the superficial aesthetics of an era, we're taking you behind the scenes.
Yeah, we are stripping all of that away.
We're stripping away the retro diner aesthetic. We're totally ignoring the malt shops and the poodle skirts.
Thank goodness.
Right. Instead, we have this brilliant, highly strategic breakdown of the 1950s. We're working from a perspective today labeled Val, and it does not treat the 1950s as some nostalgic trip down memory lane.
Not at all. It treats the decade like a complex, tightly controlled machine.
Which is so fascinating, and really it's the only way to truly understand it.
It is. If we're going to look at this era like strategists, we have to recognize that the 1950s was essentially a massive societal experiment in covering up trauma.
Yep.
We aren't just going to list off, the inventions or the pop culture milestones. We are going to explore the core tension of the decade, which this analysis brilliantly defines as the battle between comfort and conformity.
Comfort versus conformity. I love the metaphor used right out of the gate in our source material. It says, we usually picture the 1950s as this polished dining room, but today we're going to examine the furnace behind the wall.
The furnace behind the wall, that is such a great image.
It really sets the tone. We are going to uncover the invisible rules that governed everyday life. But to do that, you can't actually start in the 1950s. You have to start in the 1940s.
You really do.
The text describes the 1940s as the hammer striking the anvil, and the 1950s as the polished metal that resulted from all those blows.
The forge before the form. That is just crucial context. I mean, you cannot understand why a society would willingly subject itself to the suffocating conformity of the 1950s unless you understand the immense trauma they had just survived.
Right, the extreme pressure.
Exactly. The 1940s were completely defined by World War II. And we have to be clear about what that actually meant for the average person.
Right.
This wasn't some distant, abstract conflict playing out on a screen.
This was total war.
Total war, meaning the entire society was consumed by it. Every single factory, every farm, every household.
Economies didn't just passively support the war effort. They were completely restructured into war machines, right?
Yeah. Death, unimaginable sacrifice, and a severe, rigid discipline became entirely normalized. I mean, you had blackout curtains on your windows.
Oh, right.
You had rationing for basic goods like sugar, meat, gasoline. You couldn't just buy what you wanted.
And you were constantly surrounded by the very real possibility that a telegram would arrive at your door telling you someone you loved was just gone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Source material calls this forced discipline. It wasn't a lifestyle choice.
It wasn't like a society just deciding to be more organized for the sake of, I don't know, efficiency.
No, it was a matter of sheer biological survival. And when survival is the absolute mission, hesitation dies. The luxury of individual expression just vanishes.
So you had this relentless production in the U.S. Factories exploded with activity, right? Operating around the clock.
Around the clock, yeah. And this is where a massive, irreversible societal shift happens. Women enter the workforce in unprecedented numbers.
Okay, right. Rosie the Riveter. But we usually just look at her as a cool cultural symbol or like a piece of neat propaganda.
But she was far more than a symbol. She was an absolute economic and logistical necessity.
Because all the men were gone.
Right. With millions of men deployed overseas, the entire machinery of the nation relied on women stepping out of the domestic sphere. They stepped into heavy industry, logistics, management.
They built bombers.
They built bombers, they managed supply chains, they kept the entire country running.
And here is where the psychological analysis in our source gets really profound for me. It points out that this shifted people's core identities.
Completely.
The text notes that once people prove their capability, like once a woman realizes she can build an airplane engine, manage a crew, earn her own living, you cannot fully push her back into that old submissive domestic role without creating massive invisible tension.
You just can't put the genie back in the bottle.
Right. It planted these permanent seeds of rebellion.
It proved that society was capable of rapid, radical change. The traditional rules were suspended because they had to be. But then, layered right on top of this sudden realization of capacity, comes the most significant psychological shock in human history.
The atomic bomb.
The atomic bomb.
Yeah.
August 1945. In a single instant, humanity proved that it possessed the power to completely annihilate itself.
It's hard to even fathom what that felt like.
You really have to put yourself in the mindset of someone living through that. For all of human history, a war meant armies fighting armies. Maybe a city is besieged.
Right, traditional warfare.
But the atomic bomb meant that an entire city, men, women, children, centuries of history, could just be vaporized in a microsecond by a single device.
Which fundamentally changes the very nature of fear.
It makes fear global. It's no longer just about the enemy across the border. It's about the existential threat of complete erasure. And when fear becomes that total, that global, the human response is to crave control.
Absolute obsessive control.
Exactly.
See, I was trying to wrap my head around this rapid transition from the chaos of the 40s to the strict conformity of the 50s, and I want to push back on the timeline a bit, or at least ask a difficult question here.
Sure, go for it.
After World War I, society also experienced massive trauma, right? But the reaction to that was the Roaring '20s.
Right.
It was hedonism, it was flappers, it was breaking all the rules, drinking in speakeasies, jazz music. So why didn't the trauma of World War II result in a massive party? Why did trauma this time result in extreme, buttoned-up conformity?
That is a phenomenal question, and it gets to the absolute heart of the era's psychology. The difference between the aftermath of World War I and World War II is the lingering nature of the threat.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, after World War I, the feeling was, the war to end all wars is over. We survived. Let's celebrate. But after World War II, because of the atomic bomb and because of the immediate rise of the Soviet Union as a hostile superpower, the threat didn't end.
So the war ended, but the existential dread was actually just getting started.
Precisely.
Yeah.
You didn't get to exhale. You traded a visible kinetic war for an invisible psychological war.
Wow.
If society in the 1920s was like sailors celebrating on the deck of a ship after a storm, society in the 1950s was like a crew on a submarine running silent.
Oh, that's good.
Right. Everyone is terrified of making a noise, of standing out, of breaking protocol because the pressure outside is crushing and one single mistake could sink the whole ship.
That submarine metaphor is perfect. The analysis we are reading explicitly calls this a mental split.
Yeah, a huge split.
After the grueling slog of the 1940s, people desperately wanted peace. They wanted simplicity and order. But underneath that surface desire was unresolved trauma, profound loss, and massive, terrifying, unanswered questions about the future.
The world was officially telling its citizens, we are fine now. The economy is growing. Everything is normal.
But the collective human mind was screaming, no, we're not fine.
Exactly. The world almost ended 5 years ago, and with these new weapons, it could actually end tomorrow.
So the 1950s essentially forced a societal-level cognitive dissonance.
Yes. That massive gap between the cheerful surface narratives and the terrified internal reality is the exact birthplace of the 1950s obsession with normalcy. Normalcy wasn't natural. It was a defense mechanism.
Driven by this desperate need to cover up the trauma and manage the terror. And society didn't just accidentally stumble into prosperity either. They actively constructed it.
Highly active.
They designed and marketed a very specific, rigid blueprint for what the ideal life had to be.
And we have to look at the global geopolitical reality that was bearing down on them while they were designing this blueprint. By the early 1950s, the world had become strictly bipolar.
Right. When the source says bipolar world, it means the globe was essentially split into two massive opposing gang territories, right? There was no neutral anymore.
Correct. You had the United States and its capitalist democratic allies on one side, and the Soviet Union and its communist satellite states on the other.
Just a totally divided world.
And then in 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tests its own atomic bomb, which ends the U.S. nuclear monopoly.
That had to be terrifying.
Oh, absolutely. That same year, Communist China is established. The old European empires are exhausted and weakening, which leads to a wave of decolonization across the globe.
Which creates power vacuums.
Exactly. Power vacuums that the U.S. and the Soviets immediately rush to fill.
And then, right at the start of the decade, in June 1950, the Korean War begins.
Which was the ultimate proof that this Cold War could turn intensely, brutally hot in a matter of seconds.
So you have this incredibly fragile, terrifying global state. And the domestic reality in the U.S. shifts to accommodate it. The country transitions from Harry Truman, who had overseen the end of the war and the messy beginnings of the Cold War security state, to Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Eisenhower is the perfect avatar for the decade.
How so?
Oh, he was the supreme Allied commander during World War II. He orchestrated D-Day. To the American public, he represented the ultimate steady, competent, victorious grandfather figure.
Right, he wasn't exactly a firebrand.
Not at all. He didn't offer ideological drama or fiery rhetoric. He offered a calming, moderate conservatism. He was pro-business, staunchly anti-communist, and projected absolute stability.
And under that heavy, protective umbrella of Eisenhower's stability, the blueprint of the American dream was finalized and blasted out to the public. And it was highly specific. The source material outlines the requirements of this blueprint perfectly.
It was essentially an instruction manual for how to be an acceptable American.
Okay, let's walk through it.
Yeah.
Step 1. You get married, and you do it early. The average age of marriage absolutely plummeted, and of course, it was strictly heterosexual.
Right.
Step 2. You have children, specifically 2 to 3 kids, which fuels the massive demographic explosion we call the baby boom.
Step 3. You buy a newly built suburban home.
Step 4. The husband is the sole financial provider, commuting to a white-collar or secure blue-collar job, while the wife is entirely relegated to the role of homemaker and mother.
Step 5. You attend church. The analysis notes a fascinating statistic here. Over 90% of American adults identified as Christian during this time.
Wow, 90%. That's huge.
It is. Church attendance skyrocketed, but not just as a religious practice. It was a civic duty. It was a visible way to differentiate capitalist America from the quote-unquote godless communists of the Soviet Union.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, that's actually when "Under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954, and "In God We Trust" became the national motto in 1956.
I didn't realize those were 1950s editions. Okay, so step 6. You are fiercely patriotic and visibly anti-communist. And finally, step 7, which might be the most economically crucial one, you consume.
Mass consumption became the economic engine, but it also became a patriotic duty.
A duty to shop.
Essentially, yes. If the Soviet system was about state control and collective sacrifice, the American system proved its superiority by offering its citizens an abundance of private consumer goods.
And the economy was genuinely delivering on that front. Median family income rose from about $3,300 in 1950 to $4,200 in 1954.
A huge jump.
And because prices stayed relatively stable, that wasn't just inflation. That was a real, tangible gain in purchasing power. People had disposable income for the first time in a generation.
But to understand how this blueprint was physically constructed, we really have to look at the mechanics of the era. I mean, how did everyone suddenly end up in the suburbs?
Right, it wasn't just magic.
It wasn't an accident. It was driven by massive government intervention, primarily through the GI Bill and the Veterans Administration, or VA, home loans.
Walk me through how that actually worked, because it wasn't just a natural migration, right?
Not at all. Millions of veterans returned from the war needing housing. The government essentially guaranteed home loans for these veterans.
Okay, so less risk for the banks.
Exactly. Meaning they could buy a newly built suburban house with a fraction of the down payment previously required and with significantly lower interest rates.
And the builders just went crazy.
Whole communities like Levittown in New York were assembly line produced. Builders applied Henry Ford's mass production techniques to housing. They could literally build dozens of houses a day.
That is insane. And the landscape literally changed to support this outward expansion. The 1956 Interstate Highway Act. When I learned about this in the deep dive, it blew my mind.
It's a crazy piece of history.
We think of highways just as a convenient way to drive from, Chicago to St. Louis. But the actual name of the legislation was the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act.
Defense being the key word there. The military logic was woven right into the concrete. The highways were designed to allow for the rapid evacuation of major urban centers in the event of a nuclear attack.
Just in case the bomb dropped.
Right, and to allow the military to move troops and missiles quickly across the continent.
But the civilian byproduct was the cementing of car culture. It made the massive suburban sprawl permanently viable. You could live 20 miles away from your job and commute every day.
But of all the shifts happening, the suburbs, the highways, the incomes, the technological shift that the source highlights as the most transformative is television.
The numbers on that are just staggering.
They really are.
At the start of the decade, about 1 in 8 American homes had a television set. By the end of the 1950s, 7 in 8 homes had one.
It is arguably the most rapid and culturally dominant technological shift in human history up to that point. In less than a decade, society transitioned from a fragmented, radio and print-centered culture to a unified, visual, television-centered culture.
I mean, think about how fast that flipped society. But the brilliant point our source makes is that buying that television, or buying the new blender, or financing the massive car with the chrome tail fins, it wasn't just shopping.
No, it wasn't just about utility. It was about cultural identity.
It was proof of citizenship.
Yes, it was proof that you were successfully participating in the American promise. You had survived the Depression, you had survived the war, and here was your reward, a gleaming kitchen appliance.
But we have to remember the submarine metaphor. The text makes it incredibly clear that despite the shiny appliances and the pristine lawns, this was not a society at peace.
Right. It was a permanent low-level war mindset. The Korean War dragged on until 1953, taking tens of thousands of American lives. And even after the armistice, the Cold War hummed constantly in the background.
And television played a brilliantly dual role in managing this mindset. On one hand, it standardized culture.
Right, because of network syndication. A family sitting in their living room in Southern California and a family sitting in rural Ohio were watching the exact same sitcoms.
They were being shown the exact same visual representation of what the blueprint of normalcy looked like. The perfect wife in pearls, the wise father, the obedient children.
But on the exact same television set, on the evening news broadcasts, they were being fed a steady stream of McCarthy-era suspicion. They were watching atomic bomb tests in the Nevada desert.
So TV provided both the comforting illusion of the ideal life and the terrifying reinforcement of why that ideal life needed to be fiercely protected from outside threats.
Exactly.
Which brings us to perhaps the most fascinating and frankly the most unsettling part of this entire analysis.
The invisible enforcers.
Yes. We have this incredibly narrow, highly specific blueprint for the ideal life, and we have a population terrified of losing it. So how is this blueprint actually enforced? Because if you look at the 1950s, it's not like the government had federal police on every suburban street corner checking if you went to church or if your lawn was mowed.
It didn't need police on the corners. The brilliance and the inherent terror of the 1950s system of control is that society policed itself.
The enforcement mechanisms were entirely internalized by the communities.
Exactly.
When I was reading this section of the breakdown, the only way I could process it was to imagine a homeowners association from hell.
That's a great way to put it.
If you live in a neighborhood with a strict HOA today, maybe you get a $50 fine if you paint your mailbox the wrong color or leave your trash cans out too long. But in the 1950s version of this social HOA, if you had the wrong political thought, or you didn't fit the gender norms, or you associated with the wrong people.
You didn't get a fine.
Right. You lost your job, your kids were ostracized at school, you were effectively exiled from the community.
That is the absolute essence of psychological control. And as the source points out, psychological control is vastly cleaner and far more efficient than physical authoritarian control.
Let's break down the specific mechanisms of this invisible enforcement. First, you had the neighborhood itself.
The neighbors were the surveillance state. Seriously. The suburbs were physically designed for observation. Large picture windows, open front lawns, gossip, judgment, and the ever-present threat of social exclusion were incredibly powerful weapons.
So everyone was watching everyone else.
If a wife wasn't keeping her house pristine, or if a husband was drinking too much, or if a family didn't attend church, the neighborhood noticed. And the punishment was isolation.
It's the Tupperware party dynamic, right?
Oh, completely.
It looks like a fun social gathering to buy plastic containers, but it's actually a highly structured ritual of social conformity. You are proving your domesticity, you are proving your purchasing power, and you are engaging in the neighborhood surveillance network all at once.
Then you move from the neighborhood to the workplace. The corporate environment of the 1950s demanded absolute loyalty. The concept of the company man in his gray flannel suit wasn't just a stereotype. It was a rigid expectation.
You had to fit the mold perfectly.
Workplaces routinely conducted informal and sometimes formal loyalty checks. Your reputation, your character, and your family's behavior were all factored into your employment.
I read that in some large corporations, if a man was up for a promotion to middle management, his bosses would actually interview his wife.
Yes.
Or they'd observe her at a dinner party to make sure she was the right kind of corporate wife who wouldn't embarrass the company.
That absolutely happened. The spouse was considered part of the employee's package of conformity.
That is just wild.
And then, of course, you had the schools. Schools weren't just teaching reading and math. They were explicitly socializing children into these rigid roles.
Boys were taught leadership, stoicism, and competition.
While girls were increasingly steered away from hard sciences and toward home economics, preparing them for their inevitable role as homemakers.
But the ultimate amplifier of all this social policing, the dark cloud hanging over the entire decade, was McCarthyism.
Yes. Named after Senator Joseph McCarthy, who heavily exploited the fear of communist infiltration. But the analysis insists we must understand McCarthyism not just as a political event in Washington, D.C., but as a cultural virus that infected everyday life.
Wait, I want to clarify this because I think a lot of people assume McCarthyism was just politicians yelling at Hollywood actors or military generals in congressional hearings.
Right, the televised hearing.
Exactly. How did a regular person like a factory worker or a school teacher actually use McCarthyism against a neighbor? What were the mechanics of that?
The mechanics were based on the weaponization of accusation. The federal government had implemented loyalty oaths for its employees, but that concept trickled down rapidly.
Okay. No.
Local school boards started demanding loyalty oaths from teachers. City councils demanded them from civil servants. Private companies started blacklisting employees who were even rumored to have attended a left-leaning meeting in the 1930s.
So the burden of proof was completely inverted.
Completely. You didn't have to prove someone was a communist spy to destroy their life. You just had to accuse them of being subversive or un-American.
Wow.
Neighbors could drop anonymous tips to the FBI. A personal grudge at a factory could turn into an accusation of union agitation, which morphed into an accusation of communist sympathies. It made accusation itself a form of localized power.
So you didn't need federal laws dictating every single behavior because the sheer paralyzing fear of being labeled different did all the heavy lifting for the authorities.
Exactly. And the psychological toll of maintaining this facade was immense. Beneath that perfectly manicured suburban comfort, the text reveals a bedrock of massive, hidden anxieties.
Which brings us back to the nuclear threat. It wasn't abstract. Kids in schools were doing duck and cover drills.
Right.
They were literally being taught to hide under a wooden desk to survive an atomic blast.
While their fathers were digging holes in the backyard to install concrete fallout shelters, stocking them with canned beans and bottled water.
The cognitive dissonance is staggering. You are buying a new station wagon on Tuesday and planning for the apocalyptic end of civilization on Wednesday.
Alongside the nuclear anxiety, there was the profound fear of losing one's identity, the nagging, quiet question that must have haunted so many people. Am I actually living my life, or am I just performing a role written for me by a TV commercial?
This was heavily compounded by the crushing pressure to suppress emotion. For men, the expectation was absolute stoicism. You survive the war, you provide for your family, you do not complain, and you certainly do not discuss your trauma.
And for women, it was the pressure of total domestic subservience. You have all the modern appliances, you have a home in the suburbs, you're supposed to be perfectly happy.
Right.
If you feel empty, depressed, or unfulfilled, society tells you that you are fundamentally broken.
It all comes down to the core equation of the decade, which our source defines as the trade-off.
Yes, the big trade-off.
To get security, to get that unprecedented economic prosperity, and to get a sense of belonging in the community, people had to pay an ultimate price. They traded away their authenticity. They traded away freedom of identity.
They sacrificed individual expression on the altar of the collective aesthetic.
It highlights a profound geopolitical paradox. On the global stage, the 1950s United States loudly defined itself as the ultimate champion of freedom against the crushing state-mandated oppression of the Soviet Union. Yet, at home, the society demanded an absolute, uncompromising conformity from its own citizens.
It's a huge contradiction.
Now, if you're listening to this and thinking, hey, my grandparents grew up in the 50s and they seem genuinely happy, they love their house, they love their life, we aren't saying their happiness was fake.
Not at all.
The prosperity was real, the comfort was real. But we have to look at how the boundaries of that happiness were enforced.
And crucially, we have to look at who was allowed inside those boundaries in the first place.
Right, and this is a massive pivot in our analysis. We've established that this ideal life required a steep psychological trade-off for those who lived it. But as this source text explicitly points out, for millions and millions of people, this life wasn't a choice to make, or a trade-off to negotiate, or a goal to strive for.
It was the locked door. Val calls the system a filter.
A filter. Prosperity had strict, heavily guarded borders. If you fit the narrow demographic definition of the blueprint, you were rewarded. If you didn't, you were excluded, erased, or actively fought against by the very mechanisms of the state and society.
And I think it's important to frame this correctly for the listener.
Yes. I want to pause here and be very clear for you listening. Our goal on this show is always to unpack the source material impartially. We are going to report the historical, structural facts of the era exactly as the document presents them. We aren't projecting modern political arguments backward.
We are examining the literal, legal, and systemic realities of the 1950s to understand who was systematically left out of this heavily marketed American dream.
Exactly. The blueprint was strictly exclusive, and we must examine the specific groups that were filtered out and the mechanics of how that exclusion worked. First and foremost, Black Americans.
The reality of the 1950s for Black Americans was entirely divorced from the suburban TV sitcoms. Jim Crow laws were deeply entrenched, particularly in the South, legally enforcing racial segregation in almost every aspect of public life: schools, transportation, restaurants, water fountains.
And we must emphasize that this wasn't just a Southern issue.
Right.
While the North didn't have explicitly written Jim Crow laws, it operated on deeply entrenched de facto segregation, particularly in housing. This is where we have to explain the mechanics of redlining and the GI Bill.
Yes, earlier we talked about how the GI Bill and VA loans built the suburbs, but those benefits were not distributed equally, were they?
Not at all. A Black veteran who fought in World War II had the same theoretical GI Bill benefits as a white veteran, but when that Black veteran went to a bank to get a mortgage for a home in a new suburban development, he was routinely denied.
And this was systemic. The Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, actually had underwriting manuals that explicitly warned against introducing incompatible racial groups into newly built neighborhoods.
They claimed it would destroy property values.
Exactly.
So the developers of these massive suburban tracts like Levittown literally wrote racial covenants into the deeds of the houses, legally barring the homes from being sold to anyone who wasn't white.
So while white families were moving into the suburbs, accumulating generational wealth as their property values rose, Black families were systemically confined to increasingly underfunded urban centers.
Entirely locked out of the primary wealth-building mechanism of the era.
The text also focuses heavily on women as an excluded group, excluded not from the physical space of the home, but from economic and personal autonomy.
Right. Despite proving their immense capability in the workforce during the 1940s, women were heavily pressured and often structurally forced out of the workforce when the war ended to make room for returning men. Career ambitions for women were culturally pathologized.
Pathology.
Wait, pathologized? Meaning they were treated like a mental illness.
Yes. Popular psychology and media of the time heavily promoted the idea that a woman who desired a career over a family was suffering from a psychological disorder, a failure to embrace her natural femininity.
That is...
She was punished socially if she tried to step outside the boundaries of the home.
Then there were LGBTQ plus individuals who faced what the source describes as total systemic exclusion and existential threat.
This is a vital piece of the 1950s puzzle that is often overlooked. We talked about the Red Scare, the fear of communists, but running parallel to that and often intertwined with it was the Lavender Scare.
The Lavender Scare. Explain the mechanics of that.
So in 1953, President Eisenhower signed an executive order that officially banned homosexuals from working for the federal government.
Officially.
Officially. Equating homosexuality with being a security risk, the logic being that they could be blackmailed by Soviet spies. This led to the systemic purging of thousands of government employees. The post office was actually tracking people's mail to find evidence of their sexuality.
That is terrifying.
It was a state of total persecution. The cultural and legal climate forced LGBTQ plus individuals into absolute invisibility because being discovered carried the risk of not just losing your job, but facing public exposure, arrest, and total social destruction. Survival meant complete concealment.
The source also highlights immigrants, specifically non-European immigrants. The text cites the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act. I had to look this up because it's a piece of jargon. Can you break down what that act actually did?
Sure. To understand the McCarran-Walter Act, you have to look back to the 1920s, when the U.S. established strict national origins quotas.
Okay.
These quotas essentially heavily favored immigrants from Northern and Western Europe and severely restricted everyone else, effectively banning Asian immigration entirely.
Wow.
In 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act updated immigration law. While it technically ended the absolute ban on Asian immigrants, it preserved the deeply discriminatory quota system, reinforcing the idea of an Anglo-Saxon ideal.
So even as the U.S. was claiming moral leadership in a global Cold War, fighting for the free world, its own immigration policy was explicitly designed to maintain older racial hierarchies.
Exactly. And finally, the text notes the working poor and rural populations. While the middle class exploded, there was still a massive underclass dealing with unstable work, poor living conditions in Appalachia and inner cities.
And a complete lack of access to the financial credit loop required to buy into the suburban prosperity.
Right.
There is a quote from the source text that really stuck with me when reading through the section. It says, "The official American dream can feel like a televised performance happening for somebody else."
That is powerful.
Put yourself in that situation. Imagine being a black family in a segregated city or a poor rural farmer and watching this perfect, prosperous, heavily applianced life beamed into your living room on a television set every single night.
Knowing with absolute certainty that the system is actively legally designed to keep you from ever walking onto that set.
It's a profoundly alienating experience, but it's crucial to understand that the system wasn't entirely static. The people locked outside the filter didn't just accept it. There were massive systemic pushbacks happening beneath the surface, building the pressure that would eventually explode in the 1960s.
The most critical structural pushback mentioned in our source is the landmark 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education.
That ruling declared that segregated public schools were inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. It overturned decades of legal precedent established by Plessy v. Ferguson.
And what Brown v. Board exposed was that the decade's pristine surface order rested fundamentally on enforced inequality.
Precisely. As the analysis points out, that ruling didn't immediately settle the issue of race. Segregationists fought back massively, but what it did was sharpen the battle.
It proved that the legal foundation of the filter could be successfully challenged and broken. It sent absolute shockwaves through the enforcers of the status quo.
So we've looked at the global structures, the Cold War and the atomic bomb. We've looked at the societal rules, the blueprint, and the invisible enforcers. And we've examined who was systematically excluded by the filter.
Now let's zoom all the way in. Let's look at the raw psychology of the individual.
We need to understand what it actually felt like to wake up in the morning and live inside this massive, perfectly oiled machine.
And this source does something incredibly helpful here. Val breaks this down by generation. Because your experience of the 1950s was entirely dependent on what stage of life you were in.
It is the most effective way to understand the lived psychological experience of the era. Let's start from the bottom up. Let's look at the child, ages roughly 5 to 12.
The boomers.
The leading edge of the baby boomers, yes. Their entire world is structured, sanitized, and explicitly conditioned for obedience. They are taught at home, at church, and at school that adults have all the answers.
They are taught that the American system is morally flawless and that conformity equals safety.
But, and this is the craziest psychological paradox, at the exact same time they're being taught that the world is perfectly safe and ordered, their teachers are blowing whistles and telling them to dive under their wooden desks.
Right, duck and cover.
They have to cover their necks and close their eyes because a nuclear flash could vaporize their town at any given second.
The psychological dissonance of that cannot be overstated.
Yeah.
You have a generation of children where obedience is framed as absolute safety, yet they are simultaneously burdened with the knowledge that ultimate danger is invisible, unpredictable, and entirely out of the control of the adults they are supposed to trust.
It builds a foundation of latent background anxiety that stays with them their entire lives.
Okay, then you move up the ladder to the teenager, ages 13 to 19. And according to the text, this is where we see the very first real cracks in the system.
Why is that? Because this is the very first generation raised fully inside the television ideal. They don't really remember the trauma of the 1940s. They only know the prosperity and the rules of the 1950s.
Right, they're completely marinating in it.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
because they are marinating in it, because they haven't been traumatized by a global war, they have the luxury of observing the system objectively.
And they are the first to see the glaring, massive hypocrisy of it all.
They watch Father Knows Best or Leave It to Beaver and see these perfect, conflict-free, emotionally resolved families on TV, and then they look at their own living rooms and see the real heavily suppressed tension.
They see their fathers drinking too much to cope with the corporate pressure. They see the rigid, unfulfilling limitations placed on their mothers. They see the racial injustice happening just outside their suburban bubbles.
And the result of seeing that massive hypocrisy is friction. The teenager in the 1950s essentially becomes a distinct demographic, a separate consumer category. And this is where youth culture emerges as a legitimate form of rebellion.
Enter rock and roll.
Exactly. Rock and roll wasn't just a new genre of music with a backbeat. It was a cultural earthquake. It was loud. It was sexually suggestive. And critically, it crossed heavily policed racial lines, blending black rhythm and blues with white country music.
Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Chuck Berry. They actively, viscerally unsettled the guardians of order. Rock and roll was the sound of the pressure valve starting to hiss.
Okay, so then we get to the adult, the 20s to 40s. These are the people who actually survived the 1940s and built the blueprint. They're the ones running the machine.
The source brilliantly characterizes their mindset as disciplined containment.
Disciplined containment. They are experiencing high performance, but shockingly low freedom. They're the ones taking out the mortgages, buying the homes, working the factory lines, commuting on the new highways, maintaining the pristine lawns.
They are the direct beneficiaries of the unprecedented economic prosperity.
Yeah.
But they are absolutely terrified of losing it. They remember the Depression, they remember the rationing.
So they're willing to suppress massive, massive amounts of personal dissatisfaction just to keep the whole economic and social system afloat.
They swallow their trauma, they put on the gray flannel suit, and they go to work.
And finally, you have the elder, age 50 and up. To understand them, you have to look at the immense span of history they've witnessed.
They are the ultimate guardians of order. They lived through the crushing, soul-destroying poverty of the Great Depression in the 1930s. Then they lived through the total global chaos and bloodshed of World War II in the 1940s.
So to them, the rigid, highly controlled, sometimes suffocating stability of the 1950s isn't boring. It's not oppressive. It is a hard-earned, miraculous, blood-soaked victory.
They want to preserve it at absolutely all costs. And they look at the teenagers rebelling with rock and roll and see them as ungrateful and dangerous.
It is a generational clash of perspectives based entirely on what traumas you have or haven't endured.
It really is.
Putting all of this generational analysis together, my brain immediately went to this analogy to try and visualize the tension. Imagine society in the 1950s as this highly pressurized four-story building.
Oh, I like this. Walk me through the floors.
Okay, on the ground floor, you have the elders. They were standing guard at the front door, locking all the deadbolts, drawing the blinds, terrified that the chaos and poverty of the outside world they remember so vividly is going to break back in.
The guardians.
Right. Then on the second floor, you have the adults. They're standing there, arms raised above their heads, muscles trembling, exhausting themselves, trying to hold the ceiling up so the building doesn't collapse under the weight of the new economy.
Discipline containment.
Exactly. Then on the third floor, you have the kids. They are just hiding under their wooden desks, hands over their necks, waiting for an invisible atomic bomb to drop on the roof.
Conditioned anxiety.
And finally, on the top floor, you have the teenagers. They have just looked around and realized the whole building is a suffocating trap, and they are trying to smash the windows out with rock and roll guitars just to get some fresh air.
That is a remarkably accurate, visceral synthesis of the psychological state of the decade. It perfectly highlights the immense, invisible pressure contained within the system.
And it brings up a question I have about the people on the second floor, the adults holding up the ceiling. The text mentions this profound shift from the internal self, who you truly are, your authentic desires, to the external self, who society needs you to be. Did these adults actually believe the illusion they were building? Were they just brainwashed by the television commercials, or were they consciously playing along because they felt they had no other choice?
The analysis makes a crucial, very empathetic point here. People were not naive. They weren't stupid, and they weren't simply brainwashed automatons. They were executing a highly calculated survival strategy.
Really?
Yeah, they looked at the prosperity available to them, they looked at the stability after decades of horror, and they actively chose not to disrupt what was working economically.
They made the trade-off with their eyes open.
Yes. Identity shifted from the internal personal truth, individual quirks, unique desires, to the external, how your community perceived you, how well you fit the mold. They traded away the me to achieve the maximum level of social and economic security.
There's a line from the source document analyzing this mindset that is just chilling. It sums up the adult perspective as, I will control my life by limiting it.
It is chilling, but it is deeply rational if you've survived what they survived. You shrink your world to the size of your suburban property line, because outside of that line is chaos and nuclear annihilation.
But, as we said with the pressurized building metaphor, systems that are built entirely on suppression and exclusion don't stay stable forever.
They cannot. They are designed to hold pressure,
Hold
but by their very nature, they also build pressure. The exclusion of Black Americans built pressure, the suppression of women built pressure, the alienation of the youth built pressure, and societal pressure always, eventually, finds a catastrophic release.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's pull all these threads together. What is the grand narrative, the ultimate takeaway we can extract from Val's strategic breakdown?
The first and most obvious point is that the 1950s was not a simple, innocent, or universally happy time. That is a myth, a retro aesthetic we project backward.
It was fundamentally a foundational layer in a much larger historical structure. If we look at the mid-20th century as a continuous narrative, the 1940s created the raw chaos, the trauma, and the industrial capacity for total mobilization.
The hammer and the anvil.
Right. Then, the 1950s took that industrial capacity and built a rigidly ordered, highly controlled, meticulously filtered system to manage the trauma, the mass-produced suburbs, the monolithic mass media, the paranoid Cold War mindset.
And because that system relied so heavily on psychological suppression and systemic exclusion, it perfectly set the stage for the 1960s. The 1960s didn't just come out of nowhere. They arrived specifically to violently test, fracture, and rebel against every single invisible rule the 1950s had established.
It all comes back to that absolute core trade-off we've been discussing. The 1950s was incredibly effective at what it set out to do. It perfectly executed stability, it built the interstate highways, it exponentially grew the middle class, and it raised incomes to unprecedented levels.
But it demanded the sacrifice of authenticity, and it demanded the brutal exclusion of millions of citizens who didn't fit the picture to get there.
The system didn't fail. It worked exactly as it was designed to work. It just came with a profound, immeasurable human cost.
Exactly.
Which brings us to our final thought. At the end of the document, the text leaves us with a brilliant challenge, and I want to pose it directly to you, our listener. When you look at all the mechanics, all the suppression, all the economic growth, and all the exclusion, was the 1950s a successful decade?
It's a tough question.
Our source argues that you actually cannot answer that question until you decide how you define societal success. Is a society successful purely because it achieves economic growth, high employment, and orderly streets?
Or is success defined by freedom of expression and the ability to live an authentic life?
Is a society only successful if there is legal and social equality for all its citizens? Or is success about constant moral progress, even if it brings chaos? Based on what you personally value most in the world, you have to look at the scales and decide for yourself if the trade-offs of the 1950s were worth the price they paid.
It's a brilliant way to end the analysis. It forces you to look at history not just as a dusty set of facts to memorize, but as a mirror reflecting our own modern values back at us.
Exactly. So the next time you see that classic image of the 1950s, the polished dining room, the pristine lawn, the perfect family gathered in the glow of the television set, just remember to look a little closer at the wallpaper, because now you know about the furnace raging right behind the wall.